Hello. This is part 2 of 3 for Frank McCourt's Typhoid Fever. So if you haven't watched the first video, go back and do that. And then you'll want to move on to this video. We left, Frank had met Patricia Madigan. They were chatting. The nuns were quite annoyed at their chatter, and they're beginning to trade books, and they're getting helped out by Seamus. He's the guy who mops the floors, as Frank puts it, and he's not as strict as the Roman Catholic nuns who are running this particular fever hospital. Remember, Frank's got typhoid fever. Patricia has diphtheria, which is why they can't hang out together, because they don't want to contract the other disease, which is why they're in the fever hospital being quarantined in the first place, because they're contagious and obviously dangerous for them, dangerous for each other. All right, and so this section starts off with Seamus. He was saying that he was risking his job. He seems like a sweet gentleman, and he said that he would have to go out in the street and sing. And so that's the conversation he's continuing. He says, "Oh yes, he knows Roddy McCorley, a song. He'll sing it for me right enough, but he's barely into the first verse when the Kerry nurse rushes in. 'What's this, Seamus? Singing? Of all the people in this hospital, you should know the rules against singing. I have a good mind to report you to Sister Rita.' 'Ah, no, don't do that, nurse.' 'Very well, Seamus. I'll let it go this one time. You know the singing could lead to a relapse in these patients.' When she leaves, he whispers he'll teach me a few songs, because singing is good for passing time when you're by yourself in a typhoid room. He says Patricia is a lovely girl, the way she often gives him sweets from the parcel her mother sends every fortnight." He stops mopping the floor and calls Patricia in the next room. "I was telling Frankie you're a lovely girl, Patricia." And she says, "You're a lovely man, Seamus." He smiles, because he's an old man of 40, and he never had children but the ones he can talk to here in the fever hospital. He says, "Here's the book, Frankie. Isn't it a great pity you have to be reading all about England after all they did to us, that there isn't a history of Ireland to be had in this hospital?" So just a quick note there. Ireland and England have had a warring history, and so he's, being in Ireland, he's not thrilled that the kids have to read the history of England and not the history of Ireland. There's a bit of a rivalry dispute between them, but it's more than that. It's a history of battling each other. It continues. "The book tells me all about King Alfred and William the Conqueror and all the kings and queens down to Edward, who had to wait forever for his mother Victoria to die before he could be king. The book has the first bit of Shakespeare I ever read. 'I do believe, induced by potent circumstances, thou art mine enemy.'" The history writer says this is what Catherine, who is a wife of Henry VIII, says to Cardinal Wolsey, who is trying to have her head cut off. "I don't know what it means, and I don't care, because it's Shakespeare, and it's like having jewels in my mouth when I say the words. If I had a whole book of Shakespeare, they could keep me in the hospital for a year." It's pretty high praise. Patricia says she doesn't know what induced means or potent circumstances, and she doesn't care about Shakespeare. She has her poetry book, and she reads to me from Beyond the Wall, a poem about an owl and a pussycat that went to sea in a green boat with honey and money, and it makes no sense. And when I say that, Patricia gets huffy and says that's the last poem she'll ever read to me. She says I'm always reciting the lines from Shakespeare, and they make no sense either. Seamus stops mopping again and tells us we shouldn't be fighting over poetry, because we'll have enough to fight about when we grow up and get married. Patricia says she's sorry, and I'm sorry too. So she reads me part of another poem, which I have to remember so I can say it back to her early in the morning or late at night when there are no nuns or nurses about. "The wind was a torrent of darkness among the gusty trees. The moon was a ghostly galleon tossed upon cloudy seas. The road was a ribbon of moonlight over the purple moor, and the highwaymen came riding, riding, riding. The highwaymen came riding up to the old inn door. He had a French cocked hat on his forehead, a bunch of lace at his chin, a coat of the claret velvet, and breeches of brown doe skin. They fitted with never a wrinkle. His boots were up to the thigh, and he rode with a jeweled twinkle, his pistol butts a twinkle, his rapier hilt a twinkle, under the jeweled sky. Every day I can't wait for the doctors and nurses to leave me alone so I can learn a new verse from Patricia and find out what's happening to the highwayman and the landlord's red-lipped daughter. I love the poem because it's exciting and almost as good as my 2 lines of Shakespeare. The redcoats are after the highwayman because they know he told her, "I'll come to thee by moonlight, though hell should bar the way." Obviously, you read that poem, The Highwayman, and now you can see why we read it, so that you have some context of what is going on here. Frank obviously loves this poem, and it's a bonding between him and Patricia. I'd love to do that myself. Come by moonlight for Patricia in the next room, not giving a hoot, though hell should bar the way. She's ready to read the last few verses when in comes the nurse from Kerry, shouting at her, shouting at me. "I told you there was to be no talking between rooms. Diphtheria is never allowed to talk to typhoid, and vice versa. I warned ye." She calls out, "Seamus, take this one. Take the boy. Sister Rita said one more word out of him and upstairs with him. We gave you a warning to stop the blathering, but you couldn't. Take the boy, Seamus. Take him." "Ah, now, nurse, sure isn't he harmless? 'Tis only a bit of poetry." "Take the boy, Seamus. Take him at once." He bends over me and whispers, "I'm sorry, Frankie. Here's your English history book." He slips the book under my shirt and lifts me from the bed. He whispers that I'm a feather. I try to see Patricia when we pass through her room, but all I can make out is a blur of dark head on a pillow. Sister Rita stops us in the hall to tell me I'm a great disappointment to her, that she expected me to be a good boy after what God had done for me, after all the prayers said by hundreds of boys at the confraternity, after all the care from the nuns and nurses of the fever hospital, after the way they let my mother and father in to see me, a thing rarely allowed. And this is how I repaid them, lying in the bed, reciting silly poetry back and forth with Patricia Madigan, knowing very well there was a ban on all talk between typhoid and diphtheria. She says I'll have plenty of time to reflect on my sins in the big ward upstairs, and I should beg God's forgiveness for my disobedience, reciting a pagan English poem about a thief on a horse and a maiden with red lips who commits a terrible sin, when I could have been praying or reading the life of a saint. She made it her business to read that poem, so she did, and I'll be well advised to tell the priest in confession. The carrier nurse follows us upstairs, gasping and holding on to the banister. She tells me I better not get the notion that she'll be running up to this part of the world every time I have a little pain or a twinge. There are 20 beds in the ward, all white, all empty. The nurse tells Seamus, "Put me at the far end of the ward against the wall to make sure I don't talk to anyone who might be passing the door," which is very unlikely since there isn't another soul on this whole floor.